my name is Levon Baronian, and I'm here at Alpha News Network. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. John Eibner, who's going to be participating in this interview with us shortly. Dr. John Eibner is the president of Christian Solidarity International, a human rights group based out of Switzerland with offices throughout the world, including the United States and South Korea, that fights for the rights, the human rights, and other rights of Christians throughout the world and other peoples throughout the world. Dr. Eibner has been involved with the organization for several decades, and today we'll be talking with us about the organization's activities as they relate to the Armenian context in Artsakh, but also a little bit about, in general, about the work that they've done in other places like the Sudan. And we're going to have an open and frank conversation with Dr. Eibner. Dr. Eibner was born in New York, but spent most of his life in Europe, and he holds a PhD from the University of London in history. Thank you for being here with us today, Dr. Eibner.
Thank you. My great pleasure to be with you.
I'd like to point that Dr. Eibner was an esteemed guest of the ANCA Western Region, who honored Dr. Eibner and his organization, Christian Solidarity International, with the Religious Freedom Award. So I'd like to congratulate you on that as well, Dr. Eibner.
Thank you. That was a great honor.
Okay. So Dr. Eibner, just a little bit for our viewer about the activities of Christian Solidarity International over the last several decades. You've been involved in Armenia and Artsakh on the ground for decades, as I mentioned, even during and before the first war of Artsakh's independence in the early 90s, where you advocated for the rights of the indigenous Armenians there for self-determination. Then throughout that process, prior to the ethnic cleansing that occurred 2 years ago in Artsakh, where over 100,000 of the indigenous Armenians were displaced. And then afterwards, you've been a critic of the regime in Azerbaijan. In your special consultative status with the United Nations, you've called for sanctions and restrictions on Azerbaijan. Tell us a little bit about your activities, in Armenia and Artsakh, and specifically what you're focusing on today, please.
Okay. Thank you. CSI is a Christian interdenominational religious freedom organization. It was founded in the mid-1970s. We're coming up to our 50th anniversary. And in the early decades, CSI functioned a little bit like a small Christian Amnesty International, where there were Christian prisoners, largely in the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc, and we would campaign for their freedom. There would be protest cards and this kind of thing. And the visit to Artsakh that we made in 1991, together with the Baroness Cox, produced a fundamental change in our organization. We went, we saw, we did our fact-finding, and we felt that the situation was so horrific at the humanitarian level, and the cause of the Karabakhis for self-determination was so just that we must go back. And we went back and back and back. And through going back, we recognized that there was a humanitarian need, a terrible humanitarian need. When we arrived in early 1991, there was no United Nations there. There was no Red Cross. There was no USAID. In fact, there was nobody but CSI. And then there were a few people from Russia who came from the Andrei Sakharov circle, journalists, human rights experts. Nobody was bringing humanitarian aid. And the very first humanitarian aid action that CSI ever took had to do with taking a consignment of morphine from London to Karabakh, because Dr. Martirosyan, the surgeon at the General Hospital in Stepanakert, which was in ruins, had nothing. He had to perform amputations by giving people the local brandy to diminish the pain. And so that brought about a fundamental change in our work, whereas, yes, we continue as human rights, religious freedom advocates, but wherever possible, we deliver humanitarian aid. We're not just a talking shop. When we see people in need, we're fortunate that our supporters in the USA, in Switzerland, Germany, elsewhere in the world, want us to do more than talk about the problem. They want us to talk, but they want us, where possible, to help the victims of persecution, especially where there are Christian communities that face an existential threat. That was the case in Karabakh. That Karabakh doesn't exist today as an Armenian-occupied territory. There's been the ethnic religious cleansing. And now Armenia itself faces certain threats. I regard the situation in Armenia as one that merits concern, as a situation of existential threat to a Christian state.
Yes. And we'll get into your views on what's happening in Armenia also in a few moments. But going back to what happened in Artsakh and the ultimate ethnic cleansing 2 years ago, in September this year, you wrote that 2 years after, quote, 2 years after one of the most thorough ethnic cleansing operations in recent history, that Azerbaijan has faced absolutely no consequences. So what concrete measures does Christian Solidarity International advocate now? Is it sanctions? Is it international legal action, or something else to further, to deter further abuses and to enable Armenians to safe return to Artsakh?
Right. We don't have a special recipe that the international community must do A, B, C, and D. Mm-hmm. But they must do something. There must be some kind of measures that force Azerbaijan to rethink its policy. Mm-hmm. Right now, they've been able to do what they've done with impunity. And this must stop. There are various suggestions, sanctions, end to military aid. All of that can be very helpful. We leave that largely to others, but CSI's position is that the impunity must end, and that the Western world in particular, I mean the whole world, but really the Western world, which pays so much lip service to human rights and Western values, etc., should not accept it. And there are various measures, military, having to do with military support, economic support, simply legitimacy of the regime there, not providing it with international platforms. These kinds of things must be done, and we'll continue to press for them to be done. But right now, they are not being done. And I must say, I don't see signs of an imminent change in the policies of Washington, Brussels, and the Western powers that can make a big difference.
So in 2023, when the ethnic cleansing was occurring in Artsakh, your organization and you personally were one of the first international organizations to actually characterize what's happening as genocide. In terms of that, what would you say qualified that ethnic cleansing as genocide? I mean, as Armenians, we understand that, we felt it on our skin. But as a PhD in history, obviously you understand what qualifies as genocide very well. What would you say made this also genocide?
Well, it was really quite simple. There was deportations of entire Armenian Christian villages in Karabakh at the time that we were going in, the so-called Operation Ring. It was well documented, again, by the Sakharov people. And then also our visits followed the ethnic cleansing of Sumgait and Baku, the pogroms. And so, from our point of view, it's genocide. There are entire communities that were being forcibly displaced, forcibly moved. Many people were killed, but it was mainly a matter of driving a community out of their homes and forcing them to go elsewhere. Many legal scholars will debate the issue of how do you define genocide. And to be honest, we're not really interested in the legal side of things. There was what we call genocide. There were conditions for genocide. Communities were forcibly displaced. Call it ethnic cleansing or ethno-religious cleansing. It's usually referred to as ethnic cleansing, but there's a religious dimension to it because the Armenians are a Christian people. Those that are responsible for the ethno-religious cleansing are not. we don't speak too much about the religious dimension, but there actually is an important religious dimension in all of this.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about why Azerbaijan continues to get away with this. Ultimately, we all know that the petrodollar and the effect of natural resources and the export of those natural resources, including oil and gas from Azerbaijan, have become kind of priorities to secure by different geopolitical interests. And often we see that that kind of is a hindrance to democratic and religious freedoms. And not just in Azerbaijan, we see a lot of hypocrisy coming from the West, where dollars often trump democracy. So we were seeing that a little bit, I think, in Azerbaijan, but also the Armenian government's response hasn't been sufficient, by the opinions of many, to all of this. For example, when Prime Minister Pashinyan was in Washington, he didn't raise the issue of the hostages that continue to remain in Baku, the political hostages, including the former leadership of the community in Artsakh, but also POWs. So the Armenian government itself is not raising this issue. And why do you think that is, in terms of the Armenian government itself not continuing to push for this? And also in light of what's happening recently in Armenia, we'll touch about that in a few minutes, about the persecution of religious freedom in Armenia today. So first, in terms of Azerbaijan, why do you think that the Armenian government isn't taking a more vocal stance against what's happening?
Yeah, of course, I can only speculate about the actions or inaction of the Armenian government, but they clearly are acting under the threat of war. A war was lost. Azerbaijan threatens Armenia in many different ways. It claims Armenia, says that it's west to Azerbaijan. It's militarily much stronger. Mm-hmm. And so the Armenian government yields. And the Armenian government seems to yield with the full backing of the Western world for the reasons that you gave, because Azerbaijan and Turkey and their backers have far more weight. There's economic power there. There is political power that Armenia does not have. And we should really not be surprised that the Western world doesn't stand up for human rights and religious freedom. When one looks at the Gulf states, the United States isn't really pressing for an end to Sharia rule in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states provide certain services in a way. There's economic, there's energy that the West wants. They provide political favors. They will often act in the interest of the West when we need it. And so there's no big pressure. Human rights and religious freedom are much lower on the totem pole of American and Western interests than the geopolitical and the economic interests. And so these other interests just normally trump human rights and religious freedom concerns. Yes, and what we're seeing in Armenia is kind of is also absurd, especially in recent months, where we've seen the arrests of high-level Armenian religious leaders, specifically leaders of the Armenian Apostolic Church. What would be your characterization of what's happening in Armenia? Because on one side, the government claims that these arrests are legitimate and motivated by the fact that the church itself is meddling in politics, which it should not be doing, with the separation of church and state being used as a front for that. But don't these church leaders and institutions also have the right to express their voices about what's happening in the country? I mean, how far does the separation of church and state go? Should the separations of church and state be used as a tool to stifle the voices of religious leaders? And what do you think is going on in Armenia? I mean, the church, especially the Armenian Apostolic Church, is a national church. It's been with the people for centuries. At one stage, it was really the only national institution when Armenians didn't have any political institutions themselves. So its function is to be a voice of the national interest, the national values. So it should be speaking about political things, not as party politicians, but it must address some of the really important national issues, especially when an existential threat faces the nation. And there's no reason for, no just reason for imprisoning archbishops, bishops, priests, sending out a dragnet to haul in all kinds of church-related people. Samuel Karapetyan is imprisoned because he is a patron of the church, so he empowers the church and is an important figure in church life, even though he's a lay person. But what we see is that Azerbaijan publicly states that the Armenian Apostolic Church gets in the way of peace. So in other words, no peace treaty until the Armenian authorities denationalize or kind of deconstruct the Apostolic Church as a national church, so that all that happens in the church is that people go to worship and the religious rites are performed, and that the church does not have a voice in national life. This is a demand of Azerbaijan, and we see time after time whatever our Azerbaijan demands these days is yielded by the Armenian authorities. They have to speak for themselves as to why they do it, but that is the reason. The constitution has to be changed. So the authorities in Yerevan say we're going to change the constitution. We don't know exactly how it will be. Azerbaijan says no right to return of the Karabakhis. The authorities in Yerevan say the Karabakh issue is dead. No, we don't want to discuss it anymore. We're going to bury it 6 feet under. This is the pattern of events that we see. And the silence of Washington, Europe, the Western world, must lead us to believe that that this policy is actually supported. They want this peace treaty, they want Azerbaijan to sign, and they expect Armenia to do what is necessary to make all of the concessions necessary for Azerbaijan to sign the peace. But we know what Azerbaijan's goal is. It's to in some ways, denationalize the Armenian state. And we hear rhetoric from the prime minister. It's not prime minister of Armenia. It's nothing secret because I know about it. I read about it, making the big distinction between the Armenian nation and the Armenian state. Mm-hmm. And he makes this distinction and denigrates actually the Armenian nation. All that's important is the interest of state, and that isn't defined anymore in terms of the national interest. It's
a form of statism that separates the Armenian national interest.
Of course, it takes the church out of the public square, public discussion, and also takes the diaspora.
Absolutely.
And so the traditional way of viewing it is there's this Armenian nation that actually transcends borders. Mm-hmm. Not that there are territorial claims. I'll just give you another example. I mean,
it's an extraterritorial concept of an Armenian nation.
I know something about Central and Eastern Europe and the Hungarian concept. There are Hungarians who don't live in Hungary. They live in Romania. They live in Slovakia. They live in the former, in Serbia and Croatia. The Hungarian government regards them as part of the Hungarian nation. They have relations. They're not claiming territory, but they have relations. That the diaspora plays an important part in the national life. They have the right to vote. They're Hungarians. Mm-hmm. That's not the case with Armenia today, where there's the effort to define or really to say that this broader concept of nation doesn't apply anymore.
You raise a very good point because prior to this government, there were a few agendas, topics that were shared across the entire Armenian nation, as we call it, which included the citizens of Armenia, but also the diaspora and the citizens of Artsakh. A couple things. One was the formal recognition and securing reparations for the Armenian genocide. This was a pan-Armenian agenda, which cut across political, secular, all sorts of denominational differences. The second was the securing, and not in this order necessarily, but securing the rights of the people in Artsakh to self-determination and the ability to live on their historical lands. This was also a pan-national agenda for the Armenian people. A third, this notion that the Armenian nation is more than just the current borders of the Armenian state. It comprises the state, the diaspora, its institutions. We see that this regime in Armenia has methodically tried to destroy that entire conceptual framework upon which the Armenian people kind of viewed their existence. And Prime Minister Pashinyan is unabashed about it. He literally states as such. You mentioned the concept of the new Armenian state versus the concept of historical Armenian nation. He outright says that he's declared war on that notion of Armenian nation being all-encompassing, including institutions. And also you touched upon the point that that what's happening in Armenia is effectively a capitulation to the demands of Azerbaijan, because the Armenian church is an institution that kind of is a hindrance, is an obstacle to the demands of the Azerbaijanis. And we see that, interestingly, that and this might be anecdotal, but sometimes there aren't coincidences. Every time that the spiritual leader of the Muslims in the Caucasus, Pashazadeh, makes an announcement, 2 or 3 days later, we see a further arrests of Armenian clerics. Do you see a connection there?
Yeah, of course I see a connection. What seems to be happening is what I call the Azerbaijanization of Armenia, and that is Azerbaijan's condition for peace. So concession after concession is made, and these concessions, when taken together, mean that the Armenian state loses its unique Armenian character, spiritual heritage, and it opens the door to the political Azerbaijanization, in other words, the authoritarian style of government that you find in Turkey and Azerbaijan becomes the norm in Armenia. There's the great hope, and I don't think that it's going to turn into anything. I suspect it's an illusion that all kinds of money is going to pour into the country if these concessions are made. So those
open borders and money and business and economic development.
Yes, and the business, the money is going to come not primarily from the United States or Europe. It's going to come from Azerbaijan itself. It's going to come from Turkey. It will come from the Gulf states. And if you have a complete opening up of the borders, free movement of people, goods, money, and so on, who is going to own Armenia in 2 decades, within a generation? Who is going to own Armenia? Who is going to be living in Armenia? And I could imagine, I hope it doesn't happen, but I can imagine a time within a generation when you have Armenian ghettos or Armenian districts in Armenia. That's the logic of what is happening today. People like Erdogan and Aliyev know it, and I suspect that I really don't think that there's going to be an invasion. Why should they do it now? People are often afraid that Azerbaijan will attack again, and they may well do it. But I would have thought that they must know that it's not necessary.
And it seems that way in terms of promoting a so-called peace where there used to be very sticky issues between the Armenian and the Azerbaijani Turkish sides that needed to be reconciled, and normally those types of things happen through dialogue and mutual compromises. In this context, we see that the Armenian side is just ceding away everything. So naturally, they may claim that this is going to result in peace, but what sort of peace is it when you're capitulating to every single demand? And as you said, in short order, if Armenia is not going to become an Armenian state anymore, it's just going to be Armenia in name only. Is it worth that peace? And that's the question that we often ask ourselves and ask our viewers to ask themselves, and ask the Armenian people ultimately to ask themselves in terms of kind of deciding which direction they're going to force the government in Armenia to go. One thing that we saw recently, which was interesting, and is kind of further proof that the Armenian government is kind of capitulating to all of Azerbaijan's demands. I don't remember her name right now, but there was a certain activist that recently attended a conference in Yerevan, and multiple news outlets reported that she was actually one of the people that was heavily involved in the blockade during.
Yes.
And so, and then the government invited her as a form of as a part of a group that was there on
an NGO. Yes, I remember
peace dialogue. So it's comes back to your question: does Azerbaijan need to attack when the Armenian side is basically capitulating to every single one of their demands? And no. And the question is that peace the type of peace that the Armenian people should be subscribing to? We see that Artsakh and a lot of these Armenian interests have been put on the sacrificial table. But what do you think is the bigger reason all of this is happening? It's not. I mean, we've touched upon oil, but obviously, the United States and the West in particular has tried for decades to have a larger influence in the post-Soviet space. Many argue that the Ukraine war obviously is a proliferation of that, of the United States' attempts to bring Ukraine into NATO, and Russia's reaction to that naturally, that it's not in their position, security interests for that to happen. I think we see some of that playing out in the Caucasus as well, and unfortunately, Artsakh and the Armenian people's interests are just collateral damage in the potential de-Russification of the region. Do you see some of that playing out?
Sure,
as well?
There's a great game going on, and it affects Ukraine, it affects Moldavia, it affects really the whole borderlands of the Soviet Union. And the American strategic interest is to weaken Russia, to get Russia out of these areas, and it uses various means to do so. And Russia, in the case of Ukraine, has its interest and is prepared to fight. I hope and pray that doesn't happen in Armenia, but it could well happen in Armenia. We don't know what the outcome of the war in the Ukraine will be. Right now, Russia is in no position to have a forward policy regarding Armenia. What it could do in a year or 2 years' time, we don't know how it will play out. It's a very, very dangerous game that is being played. Again, for years I was a Cold Warrior campaigning against the Soviet Union. But it's one should be careful about poking the bear too much. It's a reality. It's a regional power, and it should be a certain level of respect has to be given. Armenia is still dependent economically on Russia, and but it's not our interest. It's not a concern of CSI. Whether Russia has a stronger hand in Armenia or Washington. But this game is being played. It's a very dangerous game, and that is what has paramount interest in Washington, the outcome of that game. But what is expected of Armenia as this game is played is that it will submit. The United States wants a peaceful, they don't want a war in this area, and at all costs. And Tom Barak, the U.S. ambassador to Turkey and special envoy for Syria, in some ways he's the big special diplomat dealing with the neo-Ottoman world. That's his function. And he, not so long ago, spoke about the region in general and said, peace is an illusion. So if the senior representative of the United States says this, we have to wonder about all this talk about peace. Is it an illusion? And then he explains what really peace is in his view. Peace is submission. Submission of the weaker powers to the stronger power. That's what he's demanding of the Alawites, Druze, Christians, so on in Syria, that they must submit to Mr. al-Jolani. And that's his recipe for peace. And of course to the Turks, because Mr. al-Jolani is an arm of Erdogan and the Turks. The same applies in Yerevan. The expectation is the weaker party, Armenia, must submit to the stronger Turkic Islamic power, and that will bring peace. There's not talk about the old-fashioned way of peace, and that is a peace with justice, a peace based on genuine reconciliation, where two sides say, let's stop this fighting, and you make compromises, and you figure out a way to live together based on reconciliation. One doesn't hear the word reconciliation anymore. It's all a matter of might is right, and might will establish peace on whatever terms might feels is appropriate.
Well, on that note, Dr. Eibner, I want to thank you on behalf of Alpha News for being our guest today in this very informative interview. Congratulations again on the award, well-deserved award received from the ANC Western Region yesterday, and Godspeed with your work, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.